So in today's video we will look at another big game that people say gets snubbed by Resident Evil 4 for helping third-person shooters adapt the over-the-shoulder camera. Here is the second video in the series looking at Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell, a brand new series that debuted in November 2002 on the original Xbox, and pretty much everything else the following year. Today I will be looking at the PS3 remaster that I bought close to the 20-year anniversary of the franchise, since it seems to play exactly like the original Xbox version from what I can tell, with an added quick save feature. So if you haven't seen my last video in this series, I recommend you at least watch the first 10 minutes of that video, as it goes over why Resident Evil 4 is so influential. I do not want to waste everybody's time going over it thoroughly again. Resident Evil 4's influence on gaming might be taken for granted to the point people can't even tell what is over the shoulder and what isn't. Now let's get into why so many people claim Splinter Cell deserves credit for the over-the-shoulder camera push that we see in so many different genres of gaming to this day. It is because it did it not only over 2 years before Resident Evil 4, but even before the Resident Evil 4 Hookman demo footage we saw at E3 2003. Yep, look at this. Just like Conker, here is the over-the-shoulder camera in action. But unlike Conker, Splinter Cell was a big financial success, according to Ubisoft. By the end of March 2004, the game had reached 6 million sold. And this launched as an Xbox-timed exclusive, when the original Xbox was barely over a year old. You heard that right. Over 6 million copies of the original Splinter Cell was sold before Resident Evil 4 had even first launched on the GameCube. Also, the Xbox version on Metacritic scored a 93, which is higher than Conker, and the same as what the remake of Resident Evil 4 would score on the same site. However, this being a multi-platform game means I should point out only the Xbox version of Splinter Cell scored higher than Conker. The Nintendo 64 version, of course. That being said, this game, like Conker and Resident Evil 4 when it released, looked absolutely mind-blowing. Heck, even more so than Conker, as the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2 were already out when Conker released. The Xbox version was quite the technical achievement in 2002 and took away a lot of attention from Metroid Prime, which released around the same time. Now let us get to the very important question: does Splinter Cell deserve more credit than it got for pioneering the over-the-shoulder camera? Well, yes and no in my opinion. I didn't touch on this very well in my Conker video, but I meant to say in it that Conker does deserve a bit more credit than it gets. I know it may have not came off that way with me giving pushback to people who say Conker was more influential than Resident Evil 4, but I think Conker was a bit ahead of its time in terms of letting you move and shoot while using the over-the-shoulder camera. It, however, was greatly held back by the Nintendo 64 controller and the fact that they didn't use it in the military section and multiplayer mode. In both Conker and Splinter Cell you could move and shoot, which even at launch Resident Evil 4 was criticized for, even if most understood why that was. And it was because it was still a Resident Evil game. Not only that, but you had some things you see in modern day third-person shooters that you did not see in Resident Evil 4 or Gears of War, which are the two big influential third-person shooters of the 2000s. The big one is that both Conker and Splinter Cell go for a free camera setup instead. You are free to look anywhere you want outside of aiming. But the important thing both Conker and Splinter Cell did was that when you do want to aim, both Conker and Sam Fisher will turn to face where the camera was facing. This is what almost every modern third-person shooter does nowadays. Look at some of the big third-person shooters after Resident Evil 4, Uncharted, and The Last of Us. In these games you can look around as freely as you want, and your character will stay in place. This is different from Resident Evil 4 and Gears of War, where the character will always be facing the direction the camera is pointed at. So this means that Splinter Cell and Conker could be inspiration for other big third-person shooters like these two games, right? Well, as I said in the last video, no. Simply because we know that Uncharted was inspired by Gears of War and Resident Evil 4. And as stated in my last video, Gears of War's use of the over-the-shoulder camera came from Resident Evil 4. Cliff Bleszinski said at GDC 2007 that, "My big pet peeve is when I see the guy blocking the line of sight. Once again he said that RE4's over-the-shoulder camera angle, which always faced the enemy, was a big influence on Gears. Which is probably the big reason both games force the character to face where the camera is facing outside of aiming your weapon. Secondly, The Last of Us was also heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4 with the clicker being the chainsaw man in that game, and the reason it uses the over-the-shoulder camera.
Bring the camera in and like shift the character to the side to get that composition, because that like changed industry and
he ended up talking about particles, and we're just like, yeah, particles, tell me more about particles. Like, so how did you do, like
and we told him, like, you know, the chainsaw guy from Resident Evil 4, that's basically our clicker.
Yes.
It's the chainsaw guy from Resident Evil 4. Like, we tell him everything, we ripped him off of his game.
Yeah. I'm sure he hates us.
Do you guys get insight from those conversations, though? Is it just geeking out and then just kind of smile and nod, or do you actually get notes?
Dead Space is a third-person shooter horror game that has a free camera like Splinter Cell and Conker. But Dead Space wasn't inspired by both of those games. It was inspired by Resident Evil 4 so much that Dead Space was originally going to be System Shock 3. Until Resident Evil 4 came out and made them make a new intellectual property that was heavily influenced by Resident Evil 4. That is the best example I can think of when it comes to the over-the-shoulder craze being kicked off by Resident Evil 4 and not Splinter Cell or Conker. So in a weird way, while Resident Evil 4 popularized the over-the-shoulder camera, it is funny how most third-person shooters would go with the free camera system that Splinter Cell and Conker had. While Resident Evil 4, which is the game that inspired so many people to use the over-the-shoulder camera, decided not to play like Conker or Splinter Cell. So then the question is, why was Resident Evil 4 the game to popularize the over-the-shoulder camera and not Splinter Cell or Conker? Well, before we do that, the dynamic over-the-shoulder camera in Resident Evil 4 was the key to making this perspective seem so much more ideal to game devs and gamers alike. In 2005 Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, the camera is more cinematic when trying to sneak up on enemies, and is night and day compared to the original Splinter Cell because it works with you like how the over-the-shoulder camera does in Resident Evil 4. Thanks to Resident Evil 4 making the over-the-shoulder camera locked onto the player's back outside of aiming, Cliff Bleszinski might have never went with it in Gears of War. Making the over-the-shoulder camera dynamic is the most brilliant thing in the original Resident Evil 4, and you probably didn't even realize it. It helps the player very subtly so much through the game, and is not really noticeable throughout 80% of the time. See how the game treats it when you have Ashley next to you and not to help let the player see her more clearly. Notice how when you get down to this area, the camera will shift downwards to help you see the enemies below. See how the camera will shift upwards here to help you see the pillars more clearly. See how when you get out of the caves the camera will subtly shift upwards to help the player focus on the buildings in the background before the cutscene plays. Notice in this room with the surprise El Gigante fight that the camera is shifted so you can see things really high up like this boulder. However, once you defeat the El Gigante, notice how it automatically goes back to normal. See how the camera will shift downwards to help you see that you can jump down here. And while it doesn't do that in every area, however, it does it when you need hints, like when these lights on the ceiling need to be taken out. The camera is always locked to a zoomed out over the shoulder perspective, and will work around that for different situations. It's the little things Resident Evil 4 did with its camera that really showed devs that this camera perspective doesn't need to be so compartmentalized. The game works around the limitations that come from keeping the camera so close to the player. If it wasn't for Resident Evil 4 making the over-the-shoulder camera such a strong focal point of its game design, I don't think the over-the-shoulder camera would have been used as much as it has been. Little things like this helped made this perspective so appealing for the whole gaming industry to this day. Uncharted even does this when it wants you to see something in the distance. Same with Gears of War. I cannot stress enough that it is one thing that a game did the over-the-shoulder camera first, which by the way there are other games that did it before Conker and Splinter Cell, which I will get into later. But it is a completely different thing to be the game that showed the industry why you should use the camera, whether it be Dark Souls or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Personally, I feel Resident Evil 4 not having a free camera at the time was the right choice. It's sort of like the original Resident Evil 4 had a set of fixed camera angles within the over-the-shoulder perspective. It's not always set to the same distance from Leon and can vary. While I don't think last year's remake of Resident Evil 4 is necessarily wrong for modernizing the game and giving the player a free camera, but it does feel like a little piece of the original Resident Evil 4 was lost in this translation. However, funnily enough, in the remake of Separate Ways, whenever Ada has her flashlight on, the camera will be locked onto her back. Just so you can't see the light coming from her shoulder is actually coming from nothing. The Last of Us does something similar, where if you have the flashlight on, the camera will be locked to Joel's back instead of a free camera, but at least they remember to render the flashlight in this game. But don't worry, I will talk a little more about the Resident Evil 4 remake later in this video. I know more third-person shooters nowadays went for the free camera, and even starting with Resident Evil 6 the series started doing the same as well. And even the remakes of Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4. So while modern third-person shooters don't fixate on the over-the-shoulder camera like the original Resident Evil 4, had it not been for Resident Evil 4, I don't think this camera would have been as mainstream as it has been for the following generations. So I don't think you can dismiss Resident Evil 4's influence on the industry just because of future third-person shooters not opting to keep the camera stuck behind the player. Resident Evil 4 inspired many different genres of gaming to use the over-the-shoulder camera, but it mainly inspired third-person shooters to use it. Yes, not every third-person shooter uses it like some competitive online games, but Conker and Splinter Cell are missing one very important thing that Resident Evil 4 made sure to do with its over-the-shoulder camera. I think a lot of people take for granted nowadays, and that is how snappy the transition is. Since I was worried about the frame rate in the PS3 remaster of Splinter Cell affecting my perspective on this, I decided to borrow a copy of the original Xbox version and play it on an Xbox One to see if I was wrong about this one thing or not. And sure enough, even on the Xbox One with the frame rate boost, the game changing from free camera to over the shoulder is not as snappy as in Resident Evil 4. It's a relatively slow animation to go from free camera to over the shoulder, which is why, like I said earlier, the over the shoulder aiming in this game and Conker felt so compartmentalized. Even worse in Conker, if you want to aim your gun, you have to press B to bring it out and get in sort of an over-the-shoulder camera perspective. Then hold R to bring the camera closer to aim in the actual over-the-shoulder camera perspective. Then hold L to bring out the laser sight and actually aim your shots. It's so compartmentalized. You can alternatively just press B and then press L to just fire off without aiming, but I haven't been able to pull off any headshots this way, which you need to do to put down zombies. The remake of Conker, which came out after Resident Evil 4, streamlined the process of aiming and made it much more simpler and effective for pulling off headshots. Interestingly enough, the remake of Conker has the aim follow where Conker is facing and not where the camera is facing. Look at how snappy it is, and that is something a third-person shooter needs. However, one thing Resident Evil 4 doesn't do is let you do this for needing to aim above or below. Splinter Cell lets you do this, but again, there is just a slight delay. And you know what? There is nothing wrong with that. The first game in the series is called Splinter Cell, Stealth Action Redefined. This is a stealth action game with a very heavy emphasis on stealth and the likes of Metal Gear. Because of how this game revolves around how visible you are in light, I bet a lot of people didn't even realize at times you were using a over-the-shoulder camera. Resident Evil 4 deciding to flesh out the over-the-shoulder camera complements the gameplay so much, and why it felt like a revolution nearly 20 years ago. How many times have you found yourself in a spot where you let yourself get surrounded by enemies only to be able to go into your inventory last second, change to a shotgun, get back into gameplay, and right before an enemy gets to you, you take them out last second? You can't really do that in Conker or Splinter Cell, or at least not to this small of a time window. It's worth pointing out the speculation of why the Ditman glitch exists is because the animation of Leon aiming the striker shotgun is sped up. But if you go into your inventory and change weapons, the sped up animation is still active, allowing the glitch to take place. This shows devs in Resident Evil 4 made sure every weapon was ready to go almost as soon as you start aiming. Anyway, the main point is that Resident Evil 4 not only feels like a third-person shooter unlike Conker and Splinter Cell, but found mechanics not present in those games that make the over-the-shoulder view very appealing to future game developers and reviewers at the time. Now for the important question. One I cannot give you a factual answer on, but one that needs to be addressed. Was Shinji Mikami possibly inspired by Splinter Cell? And honestly, just like with Conker, possibly. Shinji Mikami has been shown to like Nintendo and signed a deal with them about 6 months after Conker came out to have Resident Evil exclusivity on GameCube. It is possible that Shinji saw Conker, and when he was trying to reinvent Resident Evil said maybe I should use that over-the-shoulder viewpoint. The same could be said about Splinter Cell. Splinter Cell might have released in November 2002 for Xbox, but the GameCube version released in April of 2003 in North America. And that is only about 1 month before we first saw footage of Resident Evil 4's Hookman E3 2003 demo in May of 2003. Shinji could have saw the critical and commercial success of Splinter Cell and gained inspiration from it. Don't forget the Hookman version of Resident Evil 4 looked much slower paced. And something like Splinter Cell, which revolved around stealth and not rushing through levels, could have been a source of inspiration for Mikami and his team. The only thing we have from Mikami himself is that when Masahiro Sakurai was visiting and asked who came up with that camera in Resident Evil 4, he said he did. We may never know how Shinji Mikami came up with the camera in Resident Evil 4, but he claims he was the one who thought of putting it in the game. One thing I want to say is that Splinter Cell absolutely feels like it inspired games after it. The police station mission in Splinter Cell reminded me so much of the part in Metal Gear Solid 4, where you have to stalk a civilian in the streets without being caught. It almost feels like a nod to Splinter Cell. Another interesting thing I noticed in the GameCube version of Resident Evil 4 has this exclusive feature for the infrared scope, whereby holding X this happens. It is, as far as I can tell, only on GameCube, but it's like a vision mode sort of similar to the night vision in Splinter Cell without the green tint. I do want to point out Splinter Cell Conviction has center axis relock aiming, which Resident Evil 4 Remake uses when aiming in close quarters. Also, the remake of Resident Evil 4 gives you the option to stealth around, which can really help, and while it may not only be possibly inspired from Splinter Cell, it feels very similar in my opinion. Just a shame we can't hold someone hostage and use them as cover in Resident Evil 4 Remake. I do wonder if Mendez's eye scanner door in the original Resident Evil 4 is sort of a nod to Splinter Cell in some parts where you do this. Now I do want to point one thing out. Just because I don't think Splinter Cell deserves more credit than Resident Evil 4 in popularizing the over-the-shoulder camera, there is no denying Splinter Cell, like Conker, is one of the early pioneering titles to feature this unique camera. Conker could have just used the same camera it used in the military section or multiplayer mode for its shooting in the spooky chapter. Splinter Cell was obviously inspired by Metal Gear Solid and could have just done the same thing that series did when aiming. Go into first person. But Ubisoft Montreal decided to use the unique over-the-shoulder camera when aiming. It may not have popularized the camera, but it did stick out quite a bit, for instead of just doing the same thing Metal Gear Solid was doing at the time. So cheers for Ubisoft Montreal for taking a chance on what was at the time such a unique choice in aiming. Now, one thing you could say that helps Resident Evil 4 be associated with the over-the-shoulder camera more than the two games I have talked about so far is simply the fact that Resident Evil is known for its camera angles since it started in 1996. It does really help that Resident Evil 4 not just being a major shakeup for the whole gaming industry, but also a major shakeup in its own franchise. So much so we still have people mad that fixed cameras have been very rare in the series since 4. And pretty much gone since Resident Evil 7. So in a way I can see why some people can be jaded on this topic and think that Resident Evil 4 gets too much credit for its claim of popularizing the over-the-shoulder camera, especially when the spooky chapter in Conker and anytime you have to aim your gun in Splinter Cell have some mechanics in modern-day third-person shooters that Resident Evil 4 doesn't have. But as said before, you cannot dismiss Resident Evil 4 for being the game that made the over-the-shoulder camera more popular and being the necessary step for us to get to this point. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, I just hope I was able to make the point of this series as apparent as possible. The reason this series is called Was There a Resident Evil 4 Before Resident Evil 4 is because, obviously when looking for over-the-shoulder cameras the answer is yes. However, when it comes to finding a game that actually implemented the over-the-shoulder camera smooth enough that it is actually the one more deserving of the praise Resident Evil 4 gets for popularizing this unique perspective, the answer so far is not exactly. The arguments I see about Resident Evil 4 isn't as influential as people claim to be is very similar to the iPhone argument. Yes, there were smartphones before the iPhone and there were phones that did stuff before certain iPhone models did. So looking at it that way it is very easy to dismiss how influential Apple has been in the smartphone space. However, you have to realize a lot of things that shaped current-day smartphones were set because Apple were the ones to do them. They might not have been first on some things, but when they do introduce most things, they pull it off so smooth that everybody else has to follow if they want to keep up. When looking at it that way, you cannot deny that the iPhone was the one to influence so many others out there. Same for Resident Evil 4. Not the first to use the over-the-shoulder camera, but the one that made it matter. In all the reviews of Splinter Cell I could find only 2 of them mentioning the aim perspective. The one at Nintendo World Report just mentioned how this perspective differed from Metal Gear Solid. The other which was IGN which said this sums it up better than I could. This is a stealth game, and aiming is more of a last resort, or something you use to take out lights or cameras. In some levels I find myself using bullets to direct the attention of guards away from me. Most of the big reviewers at the time like Eurogamer were impressed by the graphics. Also thanks to this Eurogamer review we can see comments from 22 years ago, and none of them talk about the aiming perspective. GameSpot's review said hands down Splinter Cell had the best lighting of any game out there to date. Which brings me to this point right here. Greg Kasavin at GameSpot was the guy who reviewed Splinter Cell in 2003, and then also reviewed Resident Evil 4 in 2005, had said this about Resident Evil 4.
Despite Resident Evil 4's unique controls and perspective, it's easy to come to grips with how the game is played. In fact, it might leave you wondering why it took someone so long to pull off a game in this fashion, because the controls and perspective work so well. Resident Evil 4 is presented in cinematic widescreen, so if you have a standard television set, you'll view the action in letterbox format. This not only contributes to the game's movie-like feel, but it also gives you some much-needed peripheral vision of your surroundings. You view the action from behind Leon, and the perspective zooms into a close, over-the-shoulder view when you ready a weapon, which you can easily aim using its laser sight. Realistically, Leon doesn't have a perfectly steady hand when aiming, but since most of the combat occurs in brutal close quarters, you don't usually need pinpoint accuracy to get the job done. You cannot move and fire at the same time, nor can you strafe from side to side as you can in a typical shooter, though Resident Evil 4 plays very much like a shooter otherwise. The zoomed view while aiming works great for drawing a bead on your enemies, but you naturally lose some of your situational awareness in the process because you can see more of your periphery when you're not focusing on what's in front of you.
This just shows that just like Conker, that while Splinter Cell uses the over-the-shoulder viewpoint in aiming, not using a more outside of aiming and being more dynamic with the viewpoint is why Resident Evil 4's take on it felt like such a revolution. Remember in my last video when I said there were 2 games in 1998 that had the over-the-shoulder camera before Conker? Well, I kept them a secret because I thought I might want to make a video on them down the line, but I guess now is the time to reveal them. The first one is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And not only did this game in 1998 have a sort of over-the-shoulder camera, but its sequel Majora's Mask did as well in 2000 before Conker. Now the other 1998 game, and also the oldest game as far as I know with the over-the-shoulder camera, would be Mission Impossible on the Nintendo 64. Which also has a sequel in 2003, and also the original Mission Impossible feels like Splinter Cell before Splinter Cell in terms of aiming. Anyway, I might make a video on these two games down the line, but the reason I wanted to bring up Ocarina of Time really fast was that a lot of people credit lock-on targeting to Ocarina of Time. And rightfully so, for finding a way to keep track of enemies in a 3D space. However, Ocarina of Time was not the first game to use such a mechanic in the 3D space. However, more people remember Ocarina of Time's Z-targeting mechanic because of how well it worked for the game, and the same could be said for Resident Evil 4 and its take on the over-the-shoulder camera. Just because Conker, Splinter Cell, Mission Impossible and its sequel, even Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask did it first doesn't mean it did it best. Or did it in a way that gave developers and gamers an aha moment. Resident Evil 4 felt like a revolution with how well crafted it was, and a lot boiled down to the over-the-shoulder camera being used in so much more than just aiming. Splinter Cell, like Conker, may have had it before Resident Evil 4, and who knows? Conker and Splinter Cell might have inspired Shinji Mikami, but they weren't the ones that showed the industry how to pull it off. Also, like Conker, Splinter Cell didn't seem to be credited from many game devs as inspiration for its over-the-shoulder perspective when aiming. I also want to say that Splinter Cell also doesn't seem to have the same legacy as Resident Evil 4. I am not saying it doesn't have one or there isn't a huge fanbase around the Splinter Cell franchise, as many people are in fact eagerly awaiting the remake of the 2002 game, but the Splinter Cell franchise only lasted 11 years from 2002 to 2013, and thanks to Blacklist launching on PlayStation 3 and 360 just before the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were launching, it wasn't as well remembered as the previous Splinter Cell games. That being said, I hope Splinter Cell can make a huge comeback, as I feel it is a very important franchise overall to gaming. So yeah, that is pretty much all I have to say about this topic, and I hope you enjoyed the video. But before you leave, here is a preview of the next game in this video series.
Why are these people? Chainsaw. Amateurs.
Special thanks to naturalreaders.com for the text-to-speech voice.